Hello, my name's David Bruce. So if you ask jazz musicians which classical composers they like, one name that crops up more than most, even amongst people who aren't really into classical music, is Igor Stravinsky. And I think a lot of that comes down to just one piece, the Rite of Spring. I mean, just look at how many jazz versions there are of the Rite that have been made over the years. Stravinsky's career happened in almost exact parallel to the rise of jazz. His first orchestral works emerged during the years of Ragtime, and he died in 1971 as Miles Davis and Herbie Hancock were releasing some of their classic jazz fusion albums. Many of the most celebrated jazz musicians, particularly from the more experimental periods of jazz, from Charlie Parker to Charles Mingus to Ornette Coleman, have all expressed an interest in Stravinsky, and numerous of them have quoted famous passages from Stravinsky's in their solos. Here's a particularly prominent sampling of the opening of the Rite of Spring from Ornette Coleman's Sleep Talking. So many of these are among the more experimental jazz composers, and this may give us part of the clue as to where the interest lies. But overall, I would say that part of the reason why so many jazz musicians love him is that a lot of what Stravinsky does has a sort of second cousin, distant family resemblance to jazz. It's close enough to jazz that a jazz musician recognises something familiar, but it's also different enough that it can lead you into areas of music and ways of thinking about music that you might not have discovered without Stravinsky's help. And this goes for areas of rhythm, harmony, orchestration, and overall attitude. But we'll come back to that in a minute. I first wanted to look at how jazzy Stravinsky himself actually was. And the surprising answer is really not very much. I mean, think of two of the main distinguishing features of jazz: improvisation and swing. Improvisation just doesn't exist in any of Stravinsky's works. It was all precisely notated. But that's perhaps not so unexpected. But think about swing. If anything defines Stravinsky's style, it's that straight, unswung pulse. And that goes for works right across his career, from the violent string pulses in the Augurs of Spring, through to the opening of the 1966 Requiem Canticles. Across his career, there are 5 works that make an open reference to jazz. There's the Preludium for Jazz Ensemble, written in 1937, and perhaps a test piece for the more substantial Ebony Concerto, written in 1945, for Woody Herman's big band. And then there are 3 earlier ragtime pieces: Ragtime for 11 instruments, Piano Rag Music, and the short ragtime section in The Soldier's Tale. So Ebony Concerto was often cited as Stravinsky's most jazzy piece. It was after all written for one of the leading big bands of the period. But it seems that Stravinsky took the commission without knowing an awful lot about Woody Herman or his band. He wrote a clandestine note to Herman, signing it in a pseudonym, requesting a representative sample of the band's records. And later he wrote to a friend admitting he was unnerved by my lack of familiarity with this sort of thing. And the Ebony Concerto itself really isn't terribly jazzy. Sure, it does contain a few jazz tricks, like the cute Harmon-muted wah-wah at the end of the first movement, or the glissing trombones in the third movement. These trombones perhaps nod to the tailgate style of trombone playing popular in the 1920s, people like Kid Ory. But to see how deeply unjazzy the Ebony Concerto really is, just look at the writing for drum kit. There are no swinging ride cymbals, no sense of that percussion backbone that runs through all big band writing. The kit is instead very modestly used, limited to just a few military-style rolls in the second and third movements. And a passage just for tom-toms in the first. And like that trombone moment, what jazz there is in the Ebony Concerto looks back to a far earlier period of jazz. In fact, I would say that Ragtime is the only period of jazz history that Stravinsky truly interacted with. And by the way, if you want to hear more about the Ragtime influence on the Ebony Concerto, check out the video I did for London Symphony Orchestra, which I'll link to below. But even with ragtime, I think it's fair to say that Stravinsky's knowledge of the genre is pretty superficial. Or to put it more generously, he was quite limited in the ways he incorporated ragtime elements into even those pieces he called ragtimes. To give you a comparison, look at one of the most famous classical pieces based on ragtime, Debussy's Gollywog's Cakewalk. Debussy quite clearly uses two of the most characteristic aspects of the ragtime in this piece. The left hand, which alternates two chords and moves in a sort of umchar style between the bass note and the chord, and then a right hand which prominently features this rhythm. Now, there are whole academic treatises on how important that rhythm is to ragtime, but it's quite striking that even in some of the pieces Stravinsky calls ragtime, such as piano rag music, this rhythm can barely be found. In this piece, the main characteristics Stravinsky's music has in common with ragtime can be summarised as offbeat chord stabs, those umchars, and melodies that play with on-beat, off-beat rhythmic tensions. And although this all sounds like a criticism, this is really the first example of why Stravinsky might be a composer of interest to jazz musicians. He's definitely not one of those composers who trendily tries to make his own music down with the kids by being jazzy. He doesn't remind you, as Mark Anthony Turnage remarked of some composers, of that excruciating feeling you get when you hear opera singers trying to sing jazz. So Stravinsky doesn't fashionably imitate jazz, but the music itself is quite close in many of its aspects to jazz. Let's take the idea of syncopation. Here's a fairly typical ragtime piece by Scott Joplin. The left hand has that typical two-chord umchar pattern we talked about, and against the umchar we have syncopation in the right hand, syncopation which sometimes falls on the 8th note, sometimes on the 16th note. In fact, if we remove what are essentially on-beat passing notes in the right hand, you can see how syncopated the passage really is. Now firstly, umchar patterns like this are themselves extraordinarily common throughout Stravinsky's music, but let's look specifically at the petit airs movement from Stravinsky's Soldier's Tale. The bass throughout repeats a pattern of 4 8th notes, just like in the Joplin example, but against it Stravinsky plays all kinds of tricks so that the perceived downbeat is sometimes on the G, sometimes on the A. And Stravinsky doubles the aural game playing by confusing our perception of where the tonic note is as well, which sometimes seems to be the G and sometimes the A. This game playing is very typical of Stravinsky. So although this piece sounds very little like ragtime, in essence it's doing something quite similar, syncopated ideas over a constant repeating 4-note bass pattern. So similar, but expanded into whole new horizons. So for someone from the jazz world, it's relatable, but mind-expanding at the same time. In terms of harmonies, when you take away the orchestration, it's often quite surprising how jazzy parts of the Rite of Spring sound. One of the aspects of Stravinsky's style that I think particularly appeals to jazz musicians is the way of having a diatonic melody which is then harmonised by some pretty radical chords underneath. If you want to learn more about Stravinsky's use of harmony in the Ebony Concerto, check out the video I did on that a few weeks ago. Now, a lot of this comes back to that experimentation. Jazz musicians in the second half of the 20th century in particular were exploring more complex chords and modes, and many of the kinds of techniques Stravinsky used were natural areas to explore. It's interesting to compare this with the second Viennese school, the 12-tone composers like Schoenberg and Webern. Their music has been much less influential on jazz, and a large part of this, I think, is because of the way it's moved away from tonality altogether. Stravinsky's music may be dissonant and experimental, but it remained rooted in tonality, however distorted, and that, I think, made him someone that jazz composers could relate to. In terms of orchestration too, many of Stravinsky's choices seem to have had particular resonance to jazz players. Pianist Bob Gluck describes how he discovered Miles Davis's Bitches Brew and the Rite of Spring at about the same time, and one thing he noticed that they shared in common was the bass clarinet. It's true that the use of the high bassoon at the opening of the Rite of Spring is one of its most famous moments, but for Gluck it was the bass clarinet that was most significant, either operating as a sort of grist grinding away with repeating patterns in the lower register, or as one of those brief distinctive solo outbursts that punctuate major turning points in the piece. And I think he's right that you could say this makes it one of the most distinctive elements in the sound world of the whole piece. As Gluck says, like Bitches Brew, the Rite had a brew all of its own. Passages where various instruments are layered, each playing its own line, interweaving or simply juxtaposed with the others. The texture is transparent so that each individual instrument can be heard with clarity, yet what matters most is the overall sound of the ensemble. And for Gluck that formed a direct comparison with the way Miles Davis layers instruments on The Pharaoh's Dance, for example, from Bitches Brew. The other aspect of Stravinsky's orchestration that relates to jazz, particularly in the Rite, is the way the brass stabs punctuate a rhythmic line in a manner that's very similar to the style of some big band writing. So you've got the rhythm, the harmony, the orchestration, but finally, and maybe most importantly, you've got the attitude. Whether or not the famous stories of the riots at the premiere of the Rite of Spring are exaggerated or not, the piece certainly was an unleashing of a primal energy, one which is rarely heard to such a degree in classical music, but one which in jazz is actually much more common. Pianist Ethan Iverson, whose band Bad Plus recorded one of those jazz versions of the Rite we heard earlier, suggested that the Rite's red-blooded folkloric rhythm was the key to its lasting influence. Stravinsky, he said, had that earthy groove since birth. He denied it and did everything he could to keep others from getting it, but he had it, which is one of the reasons why the Rite and most of his other masterpieces will continue to gain in stature. I could talk about Stravinsky all day, there's still so much more to cover with his music, and hopefully we'll come back to more videos on it in the future. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video and you haven't already, do please consider subscribing. And if you really like what I do here on the channel, you're welcome to join my patrons over at Patreon. Do let me know in the comments if you're a jazz musician who's been influenced by Stravinsky, or if you hate him. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, and I'll see you next time.